Thank you so much for having me here today. Before I start, there's just a couple of people I'd like to thank. So there's people whose ideas are here. Stephanie Jenkins and I co-authored a piece many years ago that this talk today directly draws from. Richard Twine and I co-authored a piece. Helena Pedersen and I co-authored a piece. And so their ideas are here. In addition, Corey Nguyen, who spoke earlier for the same presentation, has made several of these same arguments that have directly helped my own intellectual trajectory. And I have changed the title. So the new title is Animal Realism, Consumerism as a Failed Strategy, the Need for Veganism as Social Justice. Let's stop the charade. Most Americans are meat eaters, and no study is going to change their minds. Instead of fighting the inexorable march towards ever more beef and poultry, let's invest in realistic solutions to our problems. Climate change is quite simply the biggest challenge we'll ever face as a species, and we'll never tackle it with such impractical goals as veganism. From the article, Stop Pretending That All Americans Could Ever Go Vegan. There are more realistic ways to combat climate change. November 16th, 2017. Part 1, Tastes Like Chicken. There is a growing number of prominent writers and thinkers who all argue that the best strategy for animal liberation is not to care about or even explicitly discuss either animals or animal rights. Perhaps the clearest example of this new strategy is Bruce Friedrich, the CEO of the Good Food Institute. For example, Friedrich, who is himself vegan, was a subject of a lengthy article in the New York Times. In this interview, Friedrich claimed that capitalism in general, and consumerism in particular, was a more effective means of animal liberation than either activism or appeals to social justice. As he phrased it, we've tried to convince the world to go vegan, and it hasn't worked. Friedrich is hoping capitalism might work where activism and persuasion fell short. Specifically, Friedrich and the Good Food Institute are focused on two consumerist options. One, the invention of ever more realistic plant-based meat alternatives, for example, Impossible Meat. And two, in particular, the creation of entirely new forms of new technology, of cell cloning of meat cells, alternatively known as in vitro, cultivated, lab-grown, or clean meat as a preferred marketing term. The rationale behind the shift is that for Friedrich and others, they believe that eating meat represents an essential aspect of human nature. Therefore, the only way to make change is to produce via technology new forms of animal meat, as they believe social activism is inherently doomed to failure. Or again, as Friedrich phrases the same idea, we need to change the meat because we aren't going to change human nature. Likewise, Ezra Klein, who is vegan, recently authored an opinion piece in the New York Times, where he repeated, in essence, this identical argument. Quote, "My reason for optimism is technological. There have been remarkable strides made in plant-based meat. Witness the success of Beyond and Impossible Foods and milks. And the next step is cultivated meat, which is meat grown directly from animal cells. This isn't science fiction. There's now a restaurant in Singapore where you can eat lab-grown chicken made by Eat Just. Unsurprisingly, it tastes like chicken because that is what it is." Nor are Friedrich and Klein far from the only vegan or vegetarian activist who've explicitly argued that animal liberation is net harmful and that the only option is to, in essence, swap one type of meat for another. For example, Matt Ball, the literal founder of an organization entitled Vegan Outreach, has likewise reached the conclusion that vegan outreach is net harmful. As he argued, in a video suggesting that animal rights activists should try and convince people from switching from eating chicken to cows. Quote, vegans are absolute fanatics who, he claims, quote, drive people back to eating meat. Ball now works with Friedrich at the Good Food Institute to develop and market in vitro meat. Likewise, Peter Singer, long considered the founder of animal rights, has come to support all of these arguments. He strongly endorses the production and consumption of in vitro meat, rejects the term vegan and suggests that others do the same, argues for capitalism and consumerism as the best, or as he phrased it in a recent interview, the most realistic option for animal liberation. This then would seem to be the positive argument currently offered by many of the very most famous, most highly regarded, and most well-funded leaders of the entire animal rights movement. A, eating meat is an essential part of human nature. All humans intrinsically, and perhaps biologically, need and want it. B, therefore, all forms of traditional animal advocacy are inherently doomed to failure, or as they choose to phrase it, not realistic. C, as such, the goal must be to switch out one form of meat for another, i.e. humane meat for meat produced in CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, cows for chickens, or most recently, in vitro meat for conventional meat. In other words, to change the meat instead of trying to change human nature. D, relatedly, both capitalism and consumerism are not problems. Indeed, they represent possible solutions for animal rights, as these advocates would have us believe that these new consumerist products will, on their own, end all forms of animal exploitation. Vegans who disagree with them must, therefore, be irrational, fanatical, utopian, or overly emotional. The solution offered by these vegans is the production of cell-based alternatives to meat, which, since it is apolitical, works with capitalism and seeks to uphold what they view as human nature has the only realistic chance of working. A win-win-win, they would have us believe, for animals, the environment, and their own startups and nonprofits, all at the same time. However, while this view seems to be widespread, indeed, I would suggest it has now become the dominant view within the animal rights community. I have several problems with it. I believe that it will not work or provide much actual success, and that will, in fact, do a great deal of harm. Problem one, it is not human nature to eat meat. As earlier mentioned, the primary belief that undermines all of these arguments is the idea that it is human nature to eat meat. To repeat, as Friedrich phrases it, quote, we need to change the meat because we're not going to change human nature. However, it is simply factually untrue that it is human nature to eat meat. For example, no people in the history of the world have eaten meat at the per capita rate we currently consume it. If eating meat was somehow intrinsic or biological, the rate of meat consumption would not have radically increased in only a very short period of time. For example, between 1910 and 2018, per capita consumption of poultry in the United States increased by 540%. It has tripled just since the 1960s. Clearly, human nature has not fundamentally changed in less than 100 years. What has changed is the invention of the CAFO system, mass production of farmed animals, mass governmental subsidies, and a constant barrage of marketing. Likewise, large percentages of the world's population do not eat meat. For example, between 20 to 31% of the population of India, that is over 300 million people, are strictly vegetarian and never consume animals at all. And over 70% of India's population, that's over 950 million people, consume animals very rarely, and then primarily seafood. Presumably, vegetarians in India have the same human nature as anyone else. Moreover, These claims of a kind of ahistorical and biological category of meat eating as human nature mask the large and growing body of literature that has documented that meat eating, particularly in the forms and ways we do it, has occurred because of a lengthy history of colonialism, white supremacy, and anti-immigrant sentiment. Colonial powers believed that colonized populations were, as they termed it, effeminate rice eaters who did not eat enough meat and used both colonialism and assimilation to increase the rate of their meat consumption. In other words, claims that we eat meat as human nature normalize as inherent and natural the wholly socially constructed history and the way that many largely plant-based populations of the world were encouraged or indeed forced to consume ever greater amounts of animal products. The main evidence that Friedrich or Ball or anyone else offers to prove that it is human nature to eat meat is to claim that there are extremely low numbers of either vegetarians or vegans in the United States. The number they cite is usually less than 2%. However, these numbers are essentially factually false. They are largely based on a single blog post by an intern with a master's degree and one poorly designed study that was never even submitted for peer review. In reality, around 9 to 10% of the US population is vegetarian or vegan, a number which has steadily grown. 12% of the population in the United States under 50 identifies as vegetarian and vegan. In any case, even if true for the US population, statements about the percentages of Americans in reality are not statements about human nature, since of course, most people in the world are not American. And as earlier documented, hundreds of millions of people throughout the world are vegetarian. In other words, even if true, why would the fact that 2% of the population in the United States is vegetarian not be dwarfed by the fact that 10% of Canadians are vegetarian, or 12% of Australians, or 14% of people in Brazil, or of course, the 20 to 31% in India? Why is it only the United States that seems to count in determining human nature? Clearly, these are differences of religion, culture, history, market, access, not arguments about human nature. Indeed, the very intense environmental problems that currently confront us are precisely because meat eating is not related to human nature, but instead is shifting based on changes in culture, marketing, and social cues. In other words, the primary drivers of the exponentially increasing rates of meat consumption are not the amount of meat consumed in the United States, but the shift by other peoples in the world, including Brazil, China, and India, which have large populations and historically have consumed little to no meat. As these countries decide to start to consume levels of meat that more closely match Western-style diets, it is doubling the global meat production. That is what is driving the exponentially increasing rates of meat consumption. However, this very shift in a relatively short period of time itself underscores the inherent plasticity of meat consumption. Whatever it is that is driving meat consumption, it cannot be human nature, since human nature has not substantially changed since, say, the 1960s, and is not somehow substantially different between, say, Brazil and the United States. However, while untrue, arguments about meat eating as human nature, as well as arguments about how no one is or will ever become vegan, still do a great deal of harm. For while it is not human nature to eat meat, it may well be human nature to want to fit in with others, to not want to be stigmatized or made fun of, to feel as if we belong. Indeed, a growing body of research on vegan stigma has claimed that stigma may be the single largest cause of why people continue to eat meat. In other words, it may be the case that every time an animal rights activist dismisses or stigmatizes veganism as unrealistic, fanatical, or anti-human nature, they may be less describing a world with less vegans as much as they are helping to create one. as a peer-reviewed article on vegan stigma phrased the same argument. Quote, non-vegans will behaviorally distance themselves by vegans by continuing to eat how they currently do in a non-vegan fashion. And this is at least partly due to the possibility of social stigma. Therefore, those of us who are concerned with increasing the number of vegans and decreasing the amount of meat consumption should not view public statements by anyone who stigmatize veganism or animal advocacy in a neutral light. Each comment that stigmatizes animal rights activists or vegans may, in fact, directly hurt the cause of either. To summarize this argument in one sentence, it may be the case that people describing the world with few vegans are, in fact, the ones helping to create it. Problem 2, consumerism is not an effective means for social change. The second major argument for replacing a social justice-based approach to veganism with a consumerist model is that it will inevitably trade off with current models of meat production. As Friedrich phrases it, we don't want people to think differently about their food. We want to change the food. Likewise, Peter Singer has made the identical argument. As Singer phrased it, quote, there are important ethical reasons why we should replace animal meat with in vitro meat, if we can do it at a reasonable cost. The first is to reduce animal suffering. Just as the cruelty inflicting on working horses, so movingly depicted in Anna Selwell's Black Beauty, was eventually eliminated by the efficiency of the internal combustion engine, so the greater quantity of suffering that is inflicted on tens of billions of animals in today's factory farms could be eliminated by a more efficient way of producing meat. However, such views of the way in which consumers' options work and markets operate is overly simplistic. For example, let me start with a classic question from a marketing class. Imagine there is a Coke vending machine by itself for many years. Now imagine that a Pepsi vending machine is placed beside it. What would you imagine would happen to the sale of Coke? Would it increase? Would it decrease by half? What about the sale of Pepsi? The actual aggregate statistical answer is that both Coke and Pepsi sales will increase. In fact, both companies know this, which is why they often strive to have their machines placed beside each other. What seems to be occurring is that when there is only one vending machine, the perceived choice is between having a Coke or not having a Coke. And at least half the time, people simply choose not to have a soft drink at all. However, when there are two vending machines, many people's perceived choice is now between a Coke and a Pepsi, increasing total sales of soft drinks. This thought experiment reveals two important points. One, consumers do not behave as we might think they would, or indeed rationally at all. And two, consumers' options often do not have the effect we imagine, and sometimes they lead to an increase of all sales instead of a decrease or a trade-off. In other words, consumers' alternatives do not necessarily in and of themselves ever lead to a decrease of another product. For example, in 2009, Coke revealed something called the plant bottle. As they phrased it, the world's first fully recyclable PET plastic bottle made partially from plants. Specifically, the bottle used plant-derived materials, such as sugarcane, to replace 30% of petroleum used to create plastic bottles. However, despite the creation of a new plant-based alternative to plastic and the resulting marketing hype by Coke, an article published by Yale found exactly the opposite results. The plant bottle did not decrease plastic use in the United States. In fact, it increased it. As the study put it, does the plant bottle mean that the giant soft drink company has cracked one of the world's most serious environmental problems, the choking of the world with oil-based plastics that never completely break down and disappear? Hardly. The reason that plant bottle led to an increase in plastic usage instead of a decline are complicated, but at least part of the reasons included that it helped to trade off and prevent regulatory pressures, laws that might have directly decreased the amount of plastic used, confused consumers, and that the plant bottle themselves involved environmental harms that were never clearly understood or explained. It is entirely possible that the new meat alternatives, for example, in vitro meat, will operate the same way as the plant bottle and plastic. Indeed, the results we do have, at least so far, in terms of plant-based meats seems to follow the same pattern. Meat-based businesses that have adopted plant-based meats, for example, Burger King's decision to sell the Impossible Whopper, have not traded off with the sales of the traditional meat-based Whopper. Indeed, those sales have increased. Doc Martens' decision to sell vegan Doc Martens did not decrease the sale of animal-based leather boots. They increased those sales. Greggs in England's decision to sell a vegan sausage roll increased the sale of the brand's traditional meat-based sausage rolls. Why these counterintuitive results are occurring is not totally clear, but it may be something called the vegan halo effect, or the way that businesses that primarily sell meat use vegan options as a way to make the brand as a whole seem sustainable, healthy, or progressive, even if most consumers keep purchasing the original meat or leather option. In a way, it may operate like the plant-based plastic bottle, which by helping customers to have a more positive view of bottled water, warding off regulatory changes, and help to lead to higher sales of plastic, even if 30% of those bottles now came from plants. And what is true of these new plant-based meat options may be even more true of in vitro meat. Its future might be similar to synthetic fiber, polyester, and its relationship to natural fabric, cotton. People buy far more polyester than cotton. However, the rise of polyester has not correlated with a decrease in the sales of cotton. Indeed, the opposite. Instead, in part by making clothes far cheaper to produce overall, polyester helped to give rise to fast fashion, i.e. cheaply made, disposable clothes designed to be quickly worn a few times and then replaced. Therefore, instead of trading off with the production of cotton, polyester has allowed for both increasing sales of polyester and cotton simultaneously. Indeed, a blended fabric containing both cotton and polyester is now the single most common material used for clothing. We don't know for sure, as the product is yet to come to market. However, the effects of synthetic meat may be the same as the effects of synthetic fabric, by making meat even cheaper to produce. While still keeping meat as desirable overall, it is wholly possible that in vitro meat could lead to ever greater rise of fast food, helping to rise overall meat consumption, in which the sales of both synthetic and conventional meat could rise simultaneously. In other words, far from a trade-off, it could lead to more meat sales overall. Like with Pepsi and Coke, consumers may start to feel as if their option was not between meat or not meat, but simply between conventional meat and synthetic meat. Like cotton and polyester, the most likely scenario may be a blended product, combining both conventional meat and in vitro meat into a single item. The conventional meat helps to provide the flavor and consumer acceptance of the product, while the synthetic meat helps to lower cost and provide higher profits. Such ideas are entirely possible, as most major food conglomerates, including both Purdue and Tyson, already use a wide variety of fillers in their product and are heavily invested in vitro meat. Here is the main point. Proponents of in vitro meat fail to understand that global meat production is exponentially increasing. In other words, proponents of in vitro meat imagine that we have a fixed number of animals killed every year, say 100 chickens. So each amount of in vitro meat must trade off with chickens raised in factory farms. However, this is not how meat production actually works. As a peer-reviewed article from 2018 phrased the same critique, quote, "It is clear that some of the narratives of the potential benefits of cultured meat implicitly assume a substitution effect, implying that rising consumption of a cultured meat would equate to a declining consumption of conventional meat. Under a full substitution effect, all traditional meat production would be replaced by cultured meat, leading to dramatic falls in animal-related emissions, land use, and slaughter. However, this assumption is not substantiated, and we should consider an addition effect in which cultured meat production works not to reduce conventional meat production, but instead to increase the total global meat consumption of cultured and conventional combined. Under a full addition effect, total meat production would not decrease at all, and neither would its environmental effects nor the number of animals slaughtered." Again, this is the intended goal of CAFOs and the reason for their continual financial support of in vitro meat, not, unsurprisingly, to put themselves out of business, but to develop yet another avenue to produce enough meat for the doubling of animal agriculture they are trying to achieve. Even when there are trade-offs, such trade-offs can be temporary or partial. Plant-based margarine correlated with a decreased sale of butter. However, this trade-off was temporary. Consumers became increasingly concerned about trans fats, started to view margarine as unnatural. Margarine sales declined, butter sales increased. The United States now sells far more butter than margarine. Lab-grown diamonds currently seem to be decreasing sales of mined diamonds. However, again, post-COVID, that industry has already started to rebound. Artificial sweeteners appear to trade off with the sale of sugar. However, despite years of developing ever new artificial sweeteners, sugar still vastly outstrips the sales of all artificial sweeteners combined. So even if there is a trade-off in sales, and there may be, there's no way for anyone to actually know for how much or for how long. And as earlier mentioned, increasing sales are also wholly possible. Consumers' options are simply an ineffective, or one might say unrealistic, means to create or sustain widespread change. Oddly, and perhaps tellingly, the major example offered as proof of the success of an in vitro meat to trade off, given by both Peter Singer and Bruce Friedrich and others, is the success of the combustible engine to replace horses. However, this is an odd example to use. Not only is it untrue, people in the United States still own over 9 million horses, and globally, people own 58 million horses, almost all of which are still exploited by humans for both recreation and labor. So the combustion engine, in fact, did not end the human own and use of horses. But even more importantly, the combustion engine, cars, is perhaps a far worse option for both humans and other animals, as it is one of the single largest drivers of climate change threatening the entire world. And indeed, that is exactly the danger we see in vitro meat, in which the majority of peer-reviewed studies have determined that in vitro meat is more energy intensive and therefore may be worse in terms of climate change than even factory farms. In other words, the very example of an apolitical technology, a consumerist option, given by these proponents from horses to cars may be exactly the correct analogy, both because it did not end the human ownership and use of horses, and because it helped to create even worse problems. Part 3, animal realism and human supremacy as a meta-narrative. However, there is, I believe, a deeper issue that underlines all of these arguments. Because I believe the main idea that motivates arguments by animal rights thinkers and activists discussed here, including Peter Singer, Bruce Frederick, Matt Ball, Ezra Klein, and others, is a concept of animal realism. By animal realism, I mean the limit of change of what they believe is possible or imaginable versus what they see as inherently utopian, irrational, sentimental, or merely emotional. Indeed, the leitmotif I keep reading are these rhetorical appeals to realism. For example, note how Klein begins his article in favor of consumerist options and in vitro meat. Quote, "I'm a vegan, but I'm also a realist. There's no chance humanity is going to give up meat en masse anytime soon." As earlier mentioned, what this formulation leaves out is if the world simply returned to eating meat at the level it did in 1950, it would achieve a global decrease of meat consumption of 75%, the amount the United Nations currently calls for in terms of ecological sustainability. Why then, we must ask, are calls to provide cell cloning of meat reasonable and logical, while calls to decrease global meat consumption to levels that they were in the 1950s somehow unreasonable, impossible, or utopian? Since the change of this rate of meat consumption only happened recently, why can't the change away from it also happen in the same amount of time? Why are only exponentially increasing levels of meat consumption realistic? Why does realism of meat seem to only flow in one direction, towards ever greater meat? Such questions are even more pertinent, as Klein's article specifically called into question the harms of cheap meat. As Klein put it, quote, "We're living right now with the true cost of cheap meat, a world of pandemics, climate emergency, and suffering both for human beings and the creatures we consume." However, oddly, he never calls for the end of the mass governmental subsidies provided to meat producers at every stage of production, which currently produce the artificially cheap meat, nor does he call for a tax. For an example, a carbon tax on meat, even though, as previous examples highlight, for example, taxes on cigarettes, such taxes can directly lead to lower rates of consumption. Indeed, what he primarily calls for is mass governmental funding of in vitro meat, even though this would not, in fact, raise the cost of conventional meat in any way. And indeed, with the works like polyester and cotton, may well produce ever more and cheaper meat. In other words, I would like to take a step back to consider how bizarrely unreasonable, utopian, indeed unrealistic in vitro meat is. Who, when considering meat consumption, would argue that the only logical solution should be to invent animal cloning, which is the single most resource-intensive aspect of all of modern biology? To invent a new form of cloning animal cells as the only realistic way to decrease the consumption of meat, particularly when virtually all current peer-reviewed data suggests such a system is inherently unscalable, as it causes more greenhouse gas emissions than even CAFOs. From where does such a prima facie utopian and unrealistic idea come from? The question relates to another question which has long perplexed me. Why is it that some of the most famous animal advocates feel the need to constantly reassure us that they do not like or even care for any actual animals? Peter Singer infamously begins the first edition of Animal Liberation with a statement that he doesn't actually like animals, as opposed to women who he claims are motivated by mere sentiment, a claim authors such as Carol Adams has long critiqued. However, perhaps we could dismiss this argument as representing an unfortunate idea in the late 1970s. But Bruce Friedrich repeats nearly verbatim this identical claim in his recent interview of In Vitro Meat. He reassures us that, quote, "Unlike some activists," Friedrich says, "he's not motivated by any sentimental or emotional attachment to other creatures." And, quote, "I didn't have a particular affinity for animals. I have a very German, logic-based temperament, for better and worse." I do not believe in or support facile comparisons between animal suffering and the suffering of human animals. I make an analogy only to point out how absurd, indeed distressing, these kind of rejoinders would be in any other context. How would we feel if someone said they were opposed to, say, sexism, however they wanted to repeatedly assure us that they did not, in fact, care about any actual women? that they supported LGBTQ+ rights, but felt the need to constantly reassure everyone that this was based on a logical thought experiment, but they didn't actually care for anyone who identified with this movement? Will we support someone who wanted to lead a movement for disability rights, but felt the need to reassure us? Because they were very German, they personally didn't care for anyone who was disabled. We do, in fact, have historical examples of people making exactly these kinds of arguments. For example, white people who spoke out against slavery while constantly reassuring white audience that they themselves did not like or care about or even support Black people. However, these disclaimers have not aged well. The view is that perhaps it was good that they had opposed race-based chattel slavery, but such statements still revealed a continuing participation and lingering support of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Likewise, the answer, I believe, that underpins these limits of the imaginable, these rhetorics of reasonability, of rationality, this move to label everyone who disagrees as irrational and fanatical, comes from a continuing participation in a meta-narrative of the inevitability of meat eating and a continuing belief in human supremacy. The French academic Lyotard famously argued that we currently live in a time in which meta-narratives no longer hold sway. People in mass no longer believe in, say, Christianity, human progress, knowledge for knowledge's sake. A decline in meta-narratives, i.e. the stories we tell about the stories we tell, which he labels as postmodern. However, I would say that while Lyotard is correct about the decline of the meta-narratives he missions, what he fails to see is the very meta-narrative that does continue to exist unabated. The primary story in ancient Greece, through Christianity, through the Enlightenment, through Romanticism, to the modern day, in fact, has never changed. The story of human uniqueness and superiority, particularly over other animals. While perhaps the reason for the support has changed, from beings made in the image of God to humans' use of reason or technology, the meta-narrative of human supremacy in the Western tradition has never faltered. For example, the Enlightenment could be read as disrupting the meta-narrative of Christianity. However, even Descartes' formulation of "I think, therefore I am" correlated with the belief that animals were mere automatons, biological machines, justifying some of the most abusive animal experimentation in human history. Descartes himself performed experiments on animals, tearing their bodies open without anesthesia to show their hearts beating, and responded to criticism by saying, quote, "A crying dog is no different than a whining gear that needs oil." The meta-narrative of human supremacy based on human reason is, I would argue, which seems to underpin part of what is understood as realistic and these performative disavows of emotion or affect. It is why I think in vitro meat seems to possess such appeal. Animal rights has long argued that it is wrong to treat animals like machines. Advocates for in vitro meat seek to change this situation quite explicitly, not by changing the way that humans think about animals, but by trying to make animals more like machines, to invent a new type of animal, clone cells, which in fact is machine-like. But greater speciesism can never end speciesism. In other words, my claim is that the supposed realism and reasonableism of in vitro meat is not based on a large body of peer-reviewed data. Such data does not exist, but instead, at least in part, because of the way that it seeks to uphold a certain understanding of the world, a meta-narrative of human supremacy based on reason and speciesism. Nor is this connection to gender lost on me. There are women who support in vitro meat, but virtually all of the most well-known and outspoken supporters are white, straight-presenting cis men who uphold tired tropes of masculinity. They're dispassionate and emotional, fetishizing technology and capitalism, claiming their views are reasonable and realistic, opposed to the largely female vegetarian and vegans who are, we are told, hysterically motivated by mere sentiment and emotional fanaticism. The myth that is constantly being propagated is that these are merely world-weary reformers reluctantly come to in vitro meat and consumerist options after a lifetime of failure fighting speciesism and anthropocentrism head-on. However, this is not what the genealogical record of animal activism would seem to suggest. The people who are now fighting for in vitro meat and consumerist options are the identical people who were earlier fighting to produce humane meat or convince people to switch from chickens to cows. In other words, proponents of in vitro meat would have you believe they've long fought the way that people perceive animals, i.e. changing human nature, and only lately have decided to change the meat, i.e. we need to change the meat because we're not going to change human nature. However, the reality is that they have always sought to change the meat, rather as the way that animals are killed or raised or confined, to which animals are eaten, to now the way they are cloned. The argument still and always has been about animals as a commodity and consumers as the force of change. This is not a new argument or strategy. It is nearly the latest update on a very old and pre-existing one. Conclusion, let's try something new. 20 years ago, I attended my last protest by PETA. We were protesting the way that KFC killed their chickens. They killed them one way, and we were supposed to argue that we wanted to kill them a different way. Across the street from the KFC was a steakhouse that was advertising veal. The protest made little sense to anyone. All the cars we leafleted kept asking us which chicken we wanted them to eat. I was scolded by the organizer when I explained that I did not want them to eat animals at all. Words such as animal liberation, anthropocentrism, even speciesism or veganism appeared nowhere at all, not in our literature, not in our signs, not in the chants. There was, as far as I could tell, no attempt to change human nature. The myth is that all animal rights organizations have long fought to change human nature, and only recently and reluctantly, after years of failure, have now decided to instead attempt to change the meat. The reality is that for at least the last 20 years, the primary focus has been one attempt after another to change the meat. Attempts to depoliticize animal liberation, to focus on consumers' options, to ignore human supremacy and focus on changing the meat is not a new argument or strategy. It is the same old strategy, which has already failed time after time after time, nearly updated with a new technological veneer. However, as every previous example shows, from plant-based plastic to polyester, consumerism is an inherently flawed system to fight for systematic change. In vitro meat does not represent newness, but stubborn persistence of the same strategies which have already failed many times before. Bruce Friedrich and I had a public debate about in vitro meat at UC Berkeley. After the debate, in our dinner together afterwards, Bruce did not argue that I'd misunderstood a study, that there was some evidence that I had overlooked that proved in vitro meat was either scalable or sustainable. What he emphasized is that he had tried everything else, but the number of animals killed just keeps going up. For someone who claims not to care about animals, it felt like a deeply personal and emotional appeal, one that I share. I too, daily worry and feel the rising death. Worry I'm arguing for incorrect strategic decisions and regularly become overwhelmed with feelings of failure and hopelessness. If we are honest, I think we all do. While I sound deeply critical, there is no vegan for whom I do not feel nearly endless respect and empathy. I get it. However, what I told Bruce that evening is what I want to leave you with at this talk today. It is not true that we have tried everything else and it has failed. Indeed, the opposite. What we have always tried are ever new consumerist options, believing somehow the products will produce the politics we hope to achieve. What we have never tried as a mass movement is veganism articulated not as a diet or a consumerist life choice, but as a social justice movement in solidarity with other social justice movements, demanding widespread political change. I am a vegan. I'm also a realist. And the only realistic option is that we pass laws to cause humanity to en masse radically decrease the consumption of all forms of meat in a very short period of time. Thank you.